Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this the beautiful ballroom of Ayers House for this event tonight. My name's David Washington. I'm the Executive Director of the Don Dunstan Foundation, formed a quarter of a century ago to continue the legacy of Don Dunstan. Don, in the months before he died, wrote the principles that still guide us. We aim to make a positive impact to policy making and to political discussion in South Australia about the issues that Don cared about. We have recently produced a new plan which has some new focus areas which people like Mike Rand believe Don would be deeply concerned about, including climate justice. So search Don Dunstan Foundation, you'll find our website soon to be completely revamped, I should say, and you can learn more about our work. But we're very pleased to be supporting this event tonight, and I'd like to say first that this is part of the History Festival, and one of the most important things about South Australian history is thousands of years of the world's longest continuous culture, the First Nations of Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the land we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. We respect our relationship with this country, this beautiful country. We acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So our very special guest tonight is Dato Dr. Ooi Kee Beng. He is the Executive Director of the Penang Institute. And I'll tell you a bit about Kee Beng. He's been studying the process of nation building in Asia and analysing Malaysian politics for decades. He received his PhD in Sinology from Stockholm University in Sweden. Before returning to his home region, he worked at Ericsson Electronics in Sweden for 22 years during the heyday of that company's mobile phone era, while studying in Stockholm University. And courses that he taught there included Chinese history, Chinese philosophy, and general knowledge of China. His major academic interests were in language philosophy and ancient Chinese political and strategic thinking. He joined Singapore's Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, now ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute, in 2004, becoming its deputy director from 2001 to 2017, when he was appointed executive director of the Penang Institute. He writes regular opinion pieces for regional and global mass media on Malaysian matters and regional matters. These have been compiled into 7 separate volumes. He's been a visiting associate professor at many different universities around the world. He's written biographies on important political personalities of Malaysia and Singapore, and some of those award-winning. So welcome tonight. It's good to have you here. After Kee Beng's talk, he will be in conversation with the Lord Mayor of Adelaide, Jane Lomax-Smith, who is also the chair of the board of the Dunstan Foundation. And we also have here tonight the chair of our Committee of Management, Matt Clemo, and committee member, Sanjukta Vastev. And we also have, among our many dignitaries tonight, we have Greg Mackey, the outgoing Chief Executive of the History Trust, who has been a great help to me, and the chair of the History Trust too, Liz Ho. Don Dunstan, I think it's fair to say, loved Malaysia. I think he made the original suggestion that Georgetown, Penang be a sister city of Adelaide. His cookbook, which he produced as Premier in the 1970s, included at least one Malaysian recipe, didn't it, Stephen? Which was unusual for the time. And I think we have deep connections with Malaysia, deeper than I think we know. But please welcome Dato Dr. Ooi Kee Beng to the stage for his talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here on this Monday evening. Well, first I would like to say that today someone asked me, I think Greg asked me, what I was academically. Well, I've studied a lot of things, but at my age, you actually don't know what you are. You get all mixed up. But I would like to be seen as a historian, but with history understood a certain way. I do not think of history as something that belongs in museums, as it were, but as something that affects us today, that has salience for how we act and how we understand ourselves and so on. Yeah, so when I came last Friday and then heard about the History Week that I've landed right in the middle of, and I asked about it, and what's affected me is that this is something I want to do back home in Penang, in Georgetown, a history week of some kind that is bottom up. That's, well, doable, isn't it? So that's one of the things I would be asking advice from David and others about how to get it done with as little money as possible and as little work as possible. Yeah, last year, my institute, Penang Institute, decided when the Penang state government said they were lacking money and they were going to close down the Georgetown Literary Festival, which had been going on for 14 years. And I said, you can't do that. I'll take it over. So Penang Institute, the think tank, took over a literary festival with no money. But then I believe that we've got millionaires in Penang, right? Somebody's going to pay the small sums. We needed just 300,000 ringgit. I don't know how much that is, maybe about 100,000 Australian. So we did that. And that same night that the news went out, one of these millionaires actually called me at home and said, how much do you need? And me being stupid just said 200K. I should have said more. But anyway, we did manage to get the HSBC bank to help out and so on. So we've got enough money. And this year, the sponsors from last year are going to do the same. So I'm hoping that this can be saved. I tell you this because I realized that a think tank doing a literary festival isn't really correct in some ways. It doesn't sing very well. So what happened when we started organizing was that the literary festival is more a language festival. Because I think from the point of view of a think tank institution, it's more about language, isn't it? It's especially nowadays with AI and algorithms and so on. It's not all that interesting just to put already famous authors on the stage and then praise them even more, It's better to discuss what language is doing to us and how the use of language is changing with AI and so on. So that's sort of the line that I want to take from now on using the Georgetown Literary Festival. And then with learning about the History Festival, I thought, well, that's actually closer to what I want. Right, but I don't think I will change the Georgetown Literary Festival to this, but maybe I could start a second one. 1 week seems doable, so you just need to get the one or two right people to buy in, and then you could do it. So thank you for that. That's one of the main inspirations I've gotten since coming to Adelaide on Friday. This is also my first visit to Australia. That might seem strange to many of you. But I did live in Sweden, which is exactly as far away as you can get from here. So that was my neighborhood, as it were. So a good reason why I never came this way. But then I met the Lord Mayor last year, and for some unknown reason, she thought I should come visit. So after a few months of planning, I did come. And I'm blown away by Adelaide, really. I didn't know such a place existed. A city that's just the right size, I think, surrounded by parklands and lovely, friendly people. And very multicultural and very accepting of multiculturalism. Malaysia is seen as a naturally multicultural place, and we get along fine with that, but it's different. So I'm hoping that if I think further and find out more about Adelaide, that there are perhaps ideas I can pick up from here that I could talk to politicians back home about, and about town planning and other things. Yeah. Anyway, that's my very long preamble, really. So I've got my speech here, so I'll try to read from that and not go off tangent too much. Now we had a work title for this talk, but you know how it is when you start writing your speech, it becomes something else. And my speech today I call Georgetown, Adelaide, and Other Siblings. Yeah. Now, sibling relationships are very complex matters, as all of you would agree with. I come from a family with 4 brothers, 2 half-brothers, and 1 half-sister, right? And I have 3 children from 2 marriages. So out of this, much insights and moments of exasperation, of course, have been gained from that in my life. I'm sure that's the case with a lot of people who have siblings. In fact, studying sibling relationships can provide effective analytical and conceptual tools through which members of the family and also the wider world can come to understand the psychological, sociological, socio-economic, and the geopolitical world which impinges on how each sibling perceives the world, separate from how their siblings do. What each sibling struggles with in their lives can differ greatly. They may be twins or they may be half-siblings, but their world will be very different. And it is in the differences and similarities between them that the diversity in the human experience and in human ambitions can be saliently mapped. What this occasion today has given me, being invited for a whole week to Adelaide and meeting all sorts of important and wonderful people, and having the opportunity to turn my mind to the past of the 2 cities of Georgetown and Adelaide, and indeed to the possible future of their relationship, is to analogize sibling relationships to those of cities instead, which have commonalities in their historical span, which have been fellow travelers in space and time. Georgetown and Adelaide, yes, very clearly. Twinning them as an administrative and diplomatic process was a commendable foresight by Don Dunstan, supported by Penang's Chief Minister Lim Chong-yu at that time. But in my analogical context, I wouldn't call them twins. Indeed, as Gorban Lee extrapolated in his book, The Light's Legacy, published by the Penang Institute, the son, William, when given the task of planning Adelaide, was probably reacting to the fact that his spiritual and reputational inheritance of Georgetown had been taken from him, and that as a new settlement, Georgetown seemed to have left much more to the personal whims of its first settlers than to any professional planner like he was. Adelaide, I would venture then, for my present purpose, was a much younger brother to Georgetown, and therefore informed at its founding by a familial wish to rectify mistakes and heal reputational damages. Speculative thought, no doubt, but one worth considering. The thing about younger siblings is that they tend to have been born into a recently constructed context, and often they are better educated. With that, they may be more hampered by social structures, but are more able to function and flow comfortably within the mainstreams of power, albeit more contained in their imagination, perhaps. Thereof, the relative freedom to act which the elder sibling is able to experience. He decides the game. Chaos is more acceptable in what he chooses to do. Spontaneous actions are more appropriate in his world, and collaborators are given by fate more than structurally provided. My first point is to highlight the subsequences following the founding of the 2 cities. One was a frontier colony with unclear and ad hoc aims. The other was a settled colony coming into being within a much more structured power constellation. The latter makes us more appreciative of William Light's personal decisions about Adelaide's founding not being in line with instructions he was given by London. His father, Francis Light, had it much easier and could make planning and economic decisions with little consideration for any Home Office boss. Apart from one Light coming much later than the other, we should consider their creations within the fast-paced geopolitical changes of the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, at this point, I need to bring in other sibling cities. Now, I have little knowledge of Australian urban history, so I shall not venture into that territory to identify relevant sibling cities to Adelaide. But from what I know, Melbourne, founded just when Adelaide also came into being, had a very different historical and socio-economic trajectory. Compared to Melbourne, Adelaide was very much a planned city. I might even venture that Adelaide was one of the first planned capital cities in the world and should be considered within such a context. Melbourne, to me, seems more like a cousin to Adelaide rather than a sibling. Maybe not even a first cousin. Well, there is at least one sibling city to Georgetown, though, which is by force of geopolitical and sociocultural history often studied as a counterpoint city. That, of course, is Singapore. Singapore was founded closer in time to Georgetown, in fact, in 1819, halfway between the founding of Georgetown and Adelaide, actually, and much closer in geopolitical and geographic space to Georgetown than Adelaide. To manifest the difference between Singapore and Georgetown, I am convinced will highlight certain traits that will help locate Adelaide in the family history. Now, Penang was founded in 1786, as you know, Singapore in 1819. Shifting our focus to the British Empire now, away from the Light family, the big difference in geopolitical time was that while Penang was founded for more tactical reasons, for mercantilistic advantages and for gains, for the elbowing of gains, Singapore was something else altogether, in my view. Singapore was founded by a Britain that was a new global power, fresh out of victory over Napoleon, and now entertaining realistic dreams about world hegemony. Well, trading and supply chain hegemony, at least. In that sense, Singapore was a strategic creation, vis-a-vis other Atlantic European powers and vis-a-vis the crumbling Qing dynasty. At that time, the China market was about to be forced open, and the opium undermining of the Chinese trade wall was thoroughly underway. Ever since the failure of the Macartney, if you've heard of this, the Macartney expedition in 1793 to Changde. Changde is a town we know as Xanadu, really, in north of Beijing. He was there to convince the Qianlong Emperor to allow more trade with the British. He failed on that score, and history tells us that after that, the British managed to break down the trade wall anyway with the smuggling of opium and so on and so forth. So to sharpen my point, Singapore was founded for the building of a trading empire, unlike Penang. Singapore was from day one a modern economy conceived of adult parents with high ambitions. In a recent article published by the Economic Society of Singapore, I portrayed Singapore as an exemplary and extreme example of an Asian city founded upon what we would recognize as modernity. I argue that Singapore was part and parcel of the political economy building of post-Napoleonic Britain. Here was another sibling with a comparatively better planned time of conception, more like Adelaide. How Penang and Singapore became the Straits Settlements after 1824, together with Malacca, which in my analogous framework I would call an adopted sibling, perhaps, along with Labuan, Christian Island, and the Cocos-Keeling Islands. This is illustrative of what the parents were up to. What were they up to? They were up to controlling the regional trade routes, keep other European powers at bay, and penetrating and perhaps monopolizing the China market. In some ways, the birth of Singapore saw their parents lose interest in their wilder and older child, Penang. Thus, Penang was left to its own devices as a localized capitalist hub and entrepot, while Singapore became an important trainee for and heir to the family's growing business in this part of the world. Now, the India side of this story, I'm sure is of great interest here too, but I shall leave it for another time. As an aside, at this point, I could mention Ceylon or Sri Lanka, more specifically perhaps Colombo itself, as a half-sibling, where British takeover of the island happened within the tactical moves taken to limit French control of the Indian Ocean and the Far East. Also, in this story, we must not forget junk Ceylon, namely Phuket, 435 kilometers north of Penang. Called Talang by the Siamese and Salang by the local population, both words meaning cape. Its full name of Tanjung Salang, Tanjung being Malay also for cape. So this is a place called Cape, you know. The word Tanjung Salang was soon corrupted in Western usage into junk Ceylon. Quite incomprehensible for us today, really. But its present name of Phuket is a simple one. It is simply a local pronunciation of the Malay word Phuket, meaning hill. Bukit, meaning hill. In fact, in some ways, I mention Phuket here because it is a sibling closest in space, time, and interest to Penang itself. Phuket was known for its deposits, and we do know that William Light's father spent a lot of time there, and in Kuala Lumpur, Kuala Kedah, a river mouth settlement opposite Penang Island itself, before he established the colony of Penang for the English East India Company in 1786. Well, in fact, migration from Phuket and Kuala Kedah is assumed to explain the fast growth of Penang's population in the early years, including an inflow of Catholic Eurasians and French missionaries fleeing the Siamese purge of Christians. This explains the strong influence that Catholic schools came to have in the Anglican enclave of Penang to this day. In understanding the multicultural harmony in Penang, one should in fact not forget, I believe, the tolerance of the first Anglican government of Penang in accepting French Catholics and Portuguese Eurasian Catholics among the island's first inhabitants. In fact, if I may ad-lib here a bit, I think that that tends to be forgotten when we think of the multicultural peace that Penang enjoys today. We tend to think of it as the result of the different Asian races being there. But of course, as is usually the case, what the English might have accomplished sort of disappears in the discussion. And this is one of the things I would like to bring out. I can only speculate about the importance of it, but that the English founded Penang and allowed Catholics to be very active in their missionary work there, I think must have contributed to this atmosphere of cultural acceptance. Now, I did do some research on this when the Lasallian movement finally came to Penang in 1852. That was why they were so successful that they soon started to import English-speaking Catholics, which was a rarity, I suppose, at that time. So that was why the Lasallian movement in Southeast Asia very quickly went from having French teachers, brothers, to having people brought from Ireland and from Quebec, I think, because these were English-speaking Catholics, which was a rarity, from what I understand at that time. Now, one last sibling city to mention, perched on this family tree I'm drawing, is, of course, Hong Kong. Despite the clear connection between the founding of Penang in 1786, of Singapore in 1819, and of Hong Kong in 1842, as a historical forward movement through the Malacca Straits towards Guangzhou and Tianjin, and as part of 19th century British global political economic building. Now, English global political economic building is my technical term for British colonization in this part of the world. That is, I won't go too much into that, but that's my way of understanding and placing, identifying it as a process that actually brought into being this list of cities that I'm talking about. But in this context, one perhaps would say that Hong Kong was conceived of another mother, as you were, while Penang and Singapore came to be populated by a mix of archipelagic peoples with a strong input of Southern Chinese and Southern Indian cultural flavors. Hong Kong remained very much a Cantonese stronghold culturally, in a way like its first cousin, Macau. Yeah? Due to their importance in trade and finance, Hong Kong and Singapore tend to be studied together today, while Penang and Singapore tend to be considered together more for anthropological reasons. Politically, though, or perhaps post-colonially, there are, to my mind, reasons that Penang and Hong Kong should be placed together as well when we study recent history. Both seem, now this is, I think, important and often missed. Both soon came to be absorbed into their immediately neighboring post-colonial countries. Penang in 1951 into the Federation of Malaysia, and Hong Kong in 1998 into the People's Republic of China, albeit with a 50-year incorporation plan, as well, which Penang did not have. Now, compared to these two, Singapore fared better. It managed to go its own way, freeing itself and finding its own teenage pad, as it were, by sticking tightly to the ambitions and rationale of its parents' global business. Now, let us distance ourselves a bit from this family history, within which cities were either founded or incorporated as part of a fast-evolving global ambition. Resistance to this 100-year anglicizing of East Asian affairs has always been there, and much poison remains in the water we drink. There's also much denial of the familial context and origins involved. The challenge for us all, as Adelaide nears the celebration of 200 years of illustrious growth, and Penang moves into its 250th year of recalcitrant existence, is to recognize our family tree and to revisit how we are connected and how we are not. Getting to know one's family is not always an easy affair, especially if the point is to build a lasting and mutually fruitful relationship as adults. Most importantly, we have to consider how the neighborhood has changed, how the village has changed, how the global context has changed. Only with that knowledge can we make good of the past, benefit from our family ties, and realize our common ambitions. Now, Adelaide lies at 35 degrees south, Singapore at 1 degree north, Penang at 5 degrees north, Sri Lanka 7 degrees north, Phuket 8 degrees north, Hong Kong 22 degrees north, all of them located between India and China. Now, this is a diasporic family we are talking about. Underlying the whole approach I've taken today is the understanding that economic growth and planning forward are very much a matter driven by urban centers, by cities. Of the cities mentioned earlier, some are major urban centers like Singapore, and some are secondary cities. I think we can consider Penang and Adelaide secondary cities. I hope I don't offend you by saying that here. Now, secondary cities, like middle siblings, tend to be creative and socially capable. I believe, personally, that much good, especially in trade, education, and culture, comes out of secondary cities. Their heads are better screwed on. And they understand their relationships are built on curiosity, humility, and honesty. In summary, what I wish to highlight is the importance of childhood, of cities in this case, the childhood of cities. In forgetting the past, we also forget our early connections to the world. And with that, we limit our present possibilities and we lose depth in our self-understanding. Therefore, knowing ourselves as we are today is best done through recogniting and recognizing our past in all its varieties. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. And now I'm welcoming Jane to the stage, who literally probably doesn't need an introduction, but I will do it anyway. Jane is a pathologist with a career in research in clinical medicine, trained in London, has worked in Boston and Adelaide, where she gained a PhD in immunology. She's run hospital departments and private practices. She is a staunch supporter of the conservation of heritage buildings, which makes it very appropriate to be here, and Adelaide Parklands. She has held elected office as a city councillor, Lord Mayor, it's her second time around, and as an MP when she was also Minister for Education and Tourism. She is chair of the Don Dunstan Foundation, which we're very grateful for, which researches and promotes ideas on social justice issues. And we will not have a Q&A at the end of this session, unusually. That's the way the House of History rolls. But we will be adjourning again in the bar afterwards if you'd like to continue the discussion. So, welcome. Jane.
Well, as you probably know, I like history, but I've also been recycled as the Lord Mayor. And this is my second round of visits to Penang. When I first went, I was pretty innocent, and I went to the parties, I did the tours. I didn't entirely think through what it meant to be a sister city. And it's only this time going back that I've thought about what it means and recognized that Penang is a no-brainer. I mean, this is a sister city relationship made in heaven. It's meant to be. History's on our side. And sometimes it's good to know how a thing happened so that you can know what it means and where it's going. And I was particularly interested to meet Kee Beng because there is an alignment between the thought leadership of the Penang Institute and the Don Dunstan Foundation, the challenge of changing government policy, which I thought was an obvious link. But you have to ask, what do we do with the sister city relationship and what is it for? And one of the first things that I've noticed about our relationship, having spoken to Kee Beng, is the problem of being in a post-colonial world. And I know that there are many people in our community who arc up at the thought of discussing settlement. And it is a challenge because everyone in this room would want to acknowledge we're on Ghana land and understands the importance of First Nations politics and history and ownership. But again, for Penang and Malaysia, there is the challenge of wanting to memorialize and give credit and accept colonization. Do you think I've overstated that, perhaps?
I think I would place myself at an extreme in wanting to accept the colonial period in order to understand what mistakes we made and what things were done right and so on. I've visited many countries in East Asia, and so it became obvious to me that each country tried their own path. They tried their own path, and they're also caught in it. Whatever path they chose, they get caught in. And then there's a certain, what do you call it, a path dependency to what's happened. So I know Malaysia better, and there you do see a very clear path of dependence. And I moved back to Malaysia about 10 years ago, having also worked on Malaysia in Singapore for 13 years before that, was that there was a change coming. the path of dependency doesn't last forever, because somewhere you run out of road, as it were. And so I think Penang is at that stage, and Penang likes to see itself as, well, when Malaya became independent, Malaysia, it became in two periods. So I'll use Malaysia and Malaysia as interchangeable. Penang always saw itself, because of its history, as being a bit different. It knows how to handle the modern world. And it didn't think that the rest of Malaya, rightly or wrongly, was as equipped as Penang itself to do this. But because our politics after 1969 became strongly racial, Penang being the only state that has a Chinese majority, sort of got sidelined. And certain policies that were put in place centrally affected Penang people a lot, especially the young. That was part of the reason I left, because I wasn't going to live under a racially defined kind of society. But things have changed. So the reason I decided to go back in 2017 was because a new generation of Malaysians had grown up. I couldn't recognize them. These were different people. They were not afraid of taking on the racial polity itself. They were going to create. They acted as if Malaysia, despite not being part of the racial majority, they were acting like they were equals. Now that excited me, because my generation was never like that. We were sort of suppressed in our thinking that, understand that this is not really your country, and so on and so forth. And so I thought, hey, I believe in stars aligning themselves. It's about recognizing that this is the time to move, and how you move depends on how you see the stars aligning. And so I thought, after the financial crisis of 1998, when Anwar Ibrahim was jailed, and then when he came out, a reform movement grew up around him, even before that. And I thought this was the time, and I came back to the region at the right time, and so on. And well, the elections did show. 2008, 5 states fell to the opposition. Not the central government, but 5 states fell at the local level. And then 2 elections later, the federal government fell. So the path of dependency had come to an end, as it were. And so I see myself, and I see the Penang Institute's role, to join and help the reform movement that's going on. What this reform movement basically means is that we do not need to follow racial lines in how we build the country, and our policy should no longer be defined by race. That is sort of my hope, and I think sometimes I'm surprised at how far we've come in this. 10 years ago, we couldn't imagine it, what's been happening now. But it actually does happen. So I do believe very strongly that lasting change does happen generationally. That's a long comment to your point. But before I go on, I would like to just apologize. I noticed that when I was reading my speech, suddenly I had an eyesight problem. I couldn't quite read what I was reading. Sorry about that.
So I think that one of the challenges in Australia is that when we have sister cities, we sometimes think that we have a lot to teach and less to learn, and sometimes they're aligned around trade. But to be really purposeful and sustainable, surely we need to actually find relationships and opportunities for people and institutions and communities. And I think that's one of the challenges with the relationship with Penang. It is essentially symmetrical. And I've been thinking about this because the first kinds of sister cities that developed after the Second World War were asymmetrical. They were about supporting devastated cities so that, there'd be post-war support for towns. There was even one that was formed in the war between Coventry and Stalingrad to support another devastated town. And there's very often a tendency now to think of Ukraine having sister cities that will be asymmetrical and will get help. And after the First World War, actually, Villers-Bretonneux was rebuilt by Australians because it was a fundraising issue. But the most sustainable relationships have to be symmetrical. And one of the things about Penang that shook me this time was the progress on climate change policy. It was an absolute commitment, it seemed, from federal, state, local government, and seemed to be supported. There was no conflict, and there seemed to be support for World Heritage listing and UNESCO bioparks, like all sorts of things that are so challenging in Australia. I think I was stunned at the progressive targets for decarbonisation. I was just shaken. Do you think that I missed something or saw something that wasn't there?
Well, no, you're correct to an extent, but if I may add that, again, I believe in the exceptionalism of Penang, of course, right? Penang has a very strong NGO tradition, and I think where climate change is concerned, that also a lot of it came out of Penang. Now, I'm not playing down the importance of Kuala Lumpur, but I don't know much about Kuala Lumpur, but from Penang, a lot of such impetus comes first from the NGOs themselves, and then the government reacts, and they play along, and suddenly it's on their agenda and so on. But it's usually started from below. I won't say from below. I don't like the top-bottom kind of picture. It comes from the middle. It comes from the educated class. It comes from the more mature part of the population who reads a lot, who knows what's going on in the world, and then they push for it. And here and there you get politicians who will pick up on that, and then you get it rolling. That would be one point I would make, that it doesn't stop. It doesn't start from the top and then comes down. It actually comes from somewhere below the top. Yeah.
So the NGOs are actually quite well funded. Do you count that as the Sovereign Wealth Fund as well, that invests in Malaysia? They seem to be supported by government, or is that because they use them as generators of policy? How does that work?
I don't see them as very well supported. But there are different ones. If I think of the more think tank type of NGOs, they tend to be supported by foreign money. Maybe coming through the CIA in different ways, I don't know. But I think those that have most better reputation, they go on their own. They're usually quite well-to-do professionals and so on. And they're the ones who tend to be the opinion makers in a way. Well, to be fair, I think here and there, if you look at the history, it's sometimes a couple of individuals, there are people who would actually put everything on the line and push for it, and then it works. And then, in a way, back to Penang society, it's basically recalcitrant. And I put that down to how it was founded, at what time it was founded, why I made an issue in my speech about the difference between Singapore and Penang. In simple terms, I tend to think that Singapore was basically founded by a wannabe empire, while Penang was founded as a recalcitrant move against the Dutch and the French, right? And then once those two were founded and the British were secure in controlling the region, Penang got a bit forgotten, for the better. Yeah.
So in terms of recalcitrance, it seems to me that the council, the Georgetown Council, is the sort of council that the state of South Australian government would love to have.
Oh.
No elections, mayor chosen, total obedience. I find it really hard to understand how that operates. It doesn't sound so much fun.
It doesn't.
As we have.
It doesn't operate very well. Well, the thing is, we've got too many layers of government at the moment. It started out with us having, well, when democracy came to Malaya. Now this is typical of the English withdrawing, right? Only when they withdraw do they give you democracy, right? like with Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So that was the same with Malaya. So our first election was in 1951, held in Penang. That was a municipal one. And the Penang people were ready for it. So our local elections, municipal elections were very, well, the federal government in the end found it very polarizing. But that was because it was done by people who were very politically conscious. But then when Malaya became Malaysia, if you know the story, when Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak became part of Malaya as well, forming Malaysia, the Indonesians went against that. So we had a small confrontation. We stopped short of calling it a war, we call it a confrontation. So during that confrontation, the federal government took that as a good chance to just end all local elections because they were too rowdy and there were always a lot of left-wing elements at that level. Penang especially had a rather strong socialist background. So they stopped that. And then
So can you just explain how it works? Because for people here it will be mystifying that they
Yeah,
have a council and they have a mayor.
If we take Penang alone, Penang is made up of two cities, two districts, as it were. Not two districts, but two cities. So it's two cities forming one state. Where elections are concerned, since '66, there have been none for the local government, and so they are appointed. They are appointed by the state government, which is elected. So you see, you have the federal government, then you have the state government. Very close below it, you have the local government that is not elected. They're all appointed. And so the state government doesn't really have to listen to them. They just have to control the mayor, right? And the mayors are appointed by them.
Yes.
So, now this...
I think it's important you don't tell the premier. This is just between us, okay?
But it does lead to one of my main complaints about Penang, which is a lovely place. It could be so easily a much better place, in that the local government is not... It doesn't have to answer to the people. It just answers to the minister in charge of them. Now that's not democracy at its best, of course.
But it's not going to change, surely.
Well, the thing was, since the elections of 2008, in all the campaigns, the opposition, which is now in power, kept saying calling for the return of local elections. And then as soon as they got power, they said, "Oh, it can't be done." Constitutionally, yes, they can't do it. But then, of course, what the public wanted, well, you don't have to do a real election. You just hold an election, and we will accept it, right? So it's not an official election, but we'll accept it anyway. I suppose that's a loophole that could be used, but of course they have not used it, and I think they've stopped talking about bringing local elections back.
So allowing for the fact we don't want anyone to know about this, that element of life in Penang, what could we do to reinvigorate our sister city relationship? We've introduced the Dunstan and the Penang Institute. What else do you think we might do to have a relationship that is meaningful and sustainable? Any ideas?
Well, to be honest, I didn't think much about any matters connected to Adelaide when I went back to Penang. And as you may have noticed when you were there last year, that this twinning thing sort of got forgotten along the way, right? But when I heard that the 50th anniversary of it was going to celebrate it, we were quite excited about it. But then there's the issue of territorialism, as it were. So the think tank has no say because the twinning is between the mayors, as it were, the community, what do you call it, the local government. So we were kept out of it. We were going to take part in it and help organize, but very quickly we noticed we were not wanted, right? And so the thing came and went. So I was very happy when you turned up, because okay, the thing isn't over yet. We can still do something about it. But at this point, I would like to go back to what you said about our twinning. You are totally right, because since I went back to Penang, we've been trying to connect with other institutions and think tanks. Taiwan, as I told you, Taiwan was interested for a while, and they put a lot into tying up with us, and then COVID happened, and then the tension between the US and China, so they've sort of withdrawn. And then a lot of new Chinese think tanks suddenly became interested in us, which was all good, but you never felt what I would feel coming to Adelaide, that there is a natural bond here. That's why that inspired me to talk about families and sibling and family trees and all that. Because just on current interests alone, you can work with people, but that's as far as it goes. But somehow with Adelaide, there is this symmetry you talk about. I didn't know much about Adelaide, but this morning when Julia Thompson from your office talked to me about it, I suddenly realized Adelaide's an island. Surrounded, it functions like an island, although it's not, right? But you have the same problems of lack of space in the city and so on and so forth. And despite all your progress and your very, very progressive policies and so on, you are still a secondary city in that sense, right? And I mean what I said earlier, that middle siblings can be, like secondary cities, that there's more thinking that goes on there, there's more strategizing. I think after your visit to Penang, you did mention that what you found interesting about Penang was that there's all this strategizing going on all the time.
Well, I was particularly impressed by the way that the strategic plans that came out of the various think tanks were then absorbed into the government and acted upon. I think here government tends to act on its own in a sort of silo and hatch ideas. So I was impressed that it seemed to be a groundswell of intellect and academic endeavour. That was impressive. But the obvious links with universities and the fact that so many people in Penang do our SACE in their year 12. And so many students come here. So we have toing and froing of people, which is another opportunity to build links. I think that very often people think sister cities are about trade and investment. We do have investment going both ways. I was particularly, I think, shocked would be true to say, about the IT sector. The 400 businesses with all the major corporations building things in Penang, but particularly producing 5% of the world's microchips. And 5% is a very small percentage, but it's a very big number of the world's microchips. And if I were thinking of a government enterprise, I would rather have my microchips coming from Penang than anywhere else, because they're sisters.
This was something that started around the same time as when we were twinned. Penang was in economic crisis in the early 70s. Well, because they took away the free port status that we lived off. Once that was gone, we were in trouble. And Lim Chong-yu, who was the other partner in the twinning, he was the one who brought in the manufacturing. He managed to work out a deal with the federal government. And so on, sort of under the radar, the microchip industry had been growing in Penang. At one time, it was recognized as a big thing, even globally. But then that fell away and it got half forgotten. And then suddenly, because of the US-China tension, suddenly it was discovered again that a lot of the chips actually come from Penang. But that situation also tells us that a lot of the production is on contract. So unlike in Taiwan, we did not develop IP, we did not develop our own MNCs. That is our weakness, and this new government recognizes this. That's what they're pushing for now. We can't just produce for the world and not use that to take us up one level. Right? So we are at that point now. But some of the factory owners that I have had the occasion to talk to, they are worried by the US-China thing, because from the US side, as soon as you have anything from China in your product, you're in trouble, right? So at the moment, they don't know how to act, really. So that's one problem we have. But again, to highlight Penang's importance, once Penang was recognized again as a microchip, a major microchip producer, the federal government, of course, moves in to take credit, right? I mean, that which is fine to an extent, but I don't want them to start coming with policies that will destroy the ecosystem that actually sustains this, which can happen, you know. Yeah.
So economies are fragile, relationships are long-lasting, and families hang together. So I think that's the moral of this evening. And perhaps I could thank Kee Beng for coming to
Relatives
Adelaide.
fight as well, you know.
And if I say just one thing, Penang's a beautiful place, and if you can think of any reason to go there, go. You won't be disappointed. It's a beautiful heritage environment with a progressive government, a well-appointed council, and fabulous food. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And as a last point, some of you might not know, but what you talked about ecological policies and so on. Where Penang is in today is that, when was this? 2008, we were listed on the UNESCO heritage list, right? And then about 3 years ago, our hills were listed also as a biodiversity center and so on. That sort of helps us keep the developers away, as it were, whatever the status of it, right?
Everybody wants to drink to that.
And then we are trying, the institute, we are behind this. We are trying to create a maritime sanctuary between the island and the mainland. And we pushed for it, and the state agreed, and then suddenly disagreed, right? But at the moment, we'll just pretend they still agree. And so we're trying to get that listed in some way as the Middle Bank Maritime Sanctuary. That will mean that Little Penang is going to have a urban heritage area next to a biodiversity region, which is quite big, and then a maritime sanctuary on this little place, you know. That's what we're hoping.
So please visit.
Yeah, please
Thank you.
visit. And our food is actually fabulous.
So thank you so much,
Thank you.
Kee Beng and Lord Mayor, for that conversation and for that talk. I found it very interesting. In this utilitarian age, I think there's a lot to be gained from open-minded discussion, and it's one reason why it's so precious that we have a month-long history festival here. So thanks to the History Trust for hosting us again. Please check out their program. There's still, I believe, 4 or 5 performances of the Audience with Don Dunstan, which is playing here at the other end in the atrium restaurant area. Thank you all for coming. The bar, I should say, is open till 8:30, so please continue the discussion out there. As you leave, Michael Boland from the excellent Wakefield Press is here with some books, and he's curated an interesting collection of political books, but also books with the Malaysian collections, including books about 2 of the great South Australian Malaysians, Chong and Kai Lu, both who have made an extraordinary contribution to South Australian culture. The Don Dunstan Foundation has events coming up in Reconciliation Week. At the end of this month, we have the annual Loitcha O'Donoghue oration over at Elder Hall. Please check out our website for details of that. We have Romney Mokak delivering the oration this year. Really a fascinating man who was the first Aboriginal person appointed to the Productivity Commission. Has a lot of insight into closing the gap policies and other things. But thanks again to Kee Beng for your contribution tonight. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.